Hey, good evening, and thanks for joining us for another Mountaineers Books web event. I'm sorry we started a little late. Yeah, okay, technical difficulties. That's what we're going to blame it on. Anyway, I'm Doug Canfield, and tonight Jeff Smoot will be telling us stories from his new book, Hangdog Days, Conflict, Change, and the Race for 514. Hangdog Days is about one of the most exciting times in rock climbing history, the period between the late 70s and the late 80s, when climbers were pushing boundaries of what, until then, had been the unspoken rules of the sport's elite. The new generation of hot young climbers weren't interested in the rules. They just wanted to climb harder routes and do it with flair. Fluorescent spandex was in, rules were out, and the holy grail was getting to be the first to send 514. Heroes of the era were climbers like Ray Jardine, John Bakar, John Long, Alan Watts, Todd Skinner, Lynn Hill, and a handful of foreigners, such as the Aussies, who were out to make their talents known. Throughout this period, Jeff Smoot was there, both as a climber and a climbing journalist. Jeff's presentation this evening is co-sponsored with two partners, the Access Fund and Mountain Madness. Access Fund is the nonprofit organization that works to keep climbing areas open and conserve the climbing environment. If you'd like to join or learn more about Access Fund, you can find them at accessfund.org. Mountain Madness is one of the world's leading guiding services, in business for 35 years. Learn more about them at mountainmadness.com. The presentation tonight will last about 40 minutes, and we will follow that with some Q&A. You can ask a question anytime during the presentation by using the question box that you can see on the right side of your screen. We'll save your questions for Jeff to answer after he has finished his presentation. So, all right, let's get started. I'm handing this over to you, Jeff.
Okay, thank you, Doug. It's great to be here. It's the first time I've done a webinar, so I hope it all goes well. I want to start off by, of course, thanking the Mountaineers for having the wisdom to publish this book, and also for the Access Fund and Mountain Madness for partnering with us on this event. So I'm going to get started here. So the slide isn't changing. How am I going to do that? There we go. All right, so I'm starting things off with a montage. I have hundreds and hundreds of photographs from back in the day when I was climbing. I was very active during the late 70s through the 80s, and took a lot of trips on the road with a lot of various characters, some of whom are pictured here. I'm going to talk about some of them during this presentation, but I can't do justice to all of it because there was just so much, and there were so many characters and so many great stories that came out of that era. So, nope, that's not what we want. How do I do this? It's not going down, it's not changing. Ask Web to change it for you. Web, are you able to change this? There we go. Okay, so I'm going to start off with the question that I most often get, and that is, what is hangdogging? And so starting off with a slide here, this is a photograph of Warren Harding from back in the, I think, the 1960s. He was a famous big wall climber in Yosemite who occasionally took his dog out onto a wall with him. I think the dog enjoyed it, but anyway, this is one of the earliest forms of hangdogging that we know. But hangdogging evolved as really all it was hanging on the rope after you fell off a climb, or you decided it was too hard, so you hung there for a minute, you rested, you tried the moves again, and eventually you were able to work out all the moves of a route. This is a picture of Todd Skinner, the self-styled renegade. He was one of the most active climbers during the early 80s and really beyond into the 90s and several years after that. And then there was Alan Watts. I would refer to him as the king of the hangdoggers. He really developed Smith Rock and is considered the godfather of sport climbing for the route development and the development of the sport as many people know it today at Smith Rock during the 1980s. So I'm including a picture of the cover of the book here. When I first saw the artwork that was done here, I kind of wondered what was with all of the psychedelic colors, because this book covered the late 70s into the 1980s, and the hippie psychedelic movement was kind of in the 60s, I thought, maybe into the early 70s, so I didn't really get what the color scheme was all about. But then I went back and was looking at my slides, and I kind of figured it out. It was the Lycra. Climbers loved to wear these Lycra tights in some of the flashiest colors that they could find. This is a picture of a British climber, Mick Johnston, who was visiting the States quite a bit during the 80s. Some climbers had rainbow and pink and lavender bodysuits. It got kind of silly after a while, but people loved this stretchy, lightweight fabric, and it was very colorful. I'll say that. So here's another picture of a couple of climbers at Smith Rock. It seemed like Smith Rock turned out to be the epicenter of the Lycra movement after a while. But, Fred Beckey wore Lycra. Don't let anybody tell you different. So going back kind of to the beginning of rock climbing in Yosemite, the golden age of Yosemite climbing, you had a couple of characters, Warren Harding on the left, Royal Robbins on the right, who had a differing approach to climbing big walls. Royal Robbins was one of the leaders of the first ascent of the northwest face of Half Dome. Warren Harding went one bigger on him and did the first ascent of the nose of El Capitan. Robbins had an ethic that favored ground up, alpine style, not reliant on equipment so much as skill and daring. Climbing was an adventure to be savored. Harding was really a workhorse. He just liked to get up there and do the hard, sweaty, manly work of climbing big walls, and if that meant pounding in a lot of pitons and placing a lot of bolts, he would do that. He didn't shy away from placing bolts if it made climbing the big walls easier, whereas Royal Robbins thought that bolts should be placed sparingly, if at all. So some of their early climbs on El Capitan sort of followed a progression. If Warren Harding climbed a route in a style that included placing a lot of bolts, Royal Robbins would climb a route in a style that minimized the amount of bolts. If Warren Harding, as he did on the first ascent of the nose, used fixed ropes all the way to the top, then Royal Robbins would climb a route without any fixed ropes at all. And so I highlighted some of the early routes that were done on El Capitan. The blue line is the approximate line of the nose, first done by Warren Harding, completed, I believe, in 1958. Fixed ropes all the way to the top. The Park Service mandated that because they didn't think that they would be able to rescue climbers from anywhere on this 3,000-foot wall with their crude capabilities at the time unless there were ropes linking them to the ground. So that ascent took quite a long time. It was done in a style that ferried loads from camp to camp as they worked their way slowly and tirelessly up to the top of the mountain. The line in red was the Salathe Wall, and that was first done by Royal Robbins, Chuck Pratt, and Tom Frost in, I believe, 1961. Maybe it was 1962, but anyway, they tossed off their fixed ropes after 900 feet and went all the way to the top without using any fixed ropes at all. And I think they only placed 1 or 2 bolts on the entire climb. It was just a long crack line. So it really was kind of the counterpoint to Harding's ascent of the nose. The line in green is the Dawn Wall, and that route was climbed by Warren Harding in 1970. And on that route, which is pictured Warren Harding climbing it on the right, a total of I believe 330 bolts were placed in about 3,000 feet of climbing. So that was a bolt or a rivet or some other drilled anchor was placed approximately every 9 feet up the wall. And this caused quite a bit of consternation among some of the valley climbers, including Royal Robbins and Yvon Chouinard, who just thought the bolts should be minimized and this sort of rock engineering wasn't the way to go. So Royal Robbins went out the next year and set about to erase the route by chopping the bolts as he climbed. And he did that for the first day, but after about 4 pitches of that, he had a change of heart. He decided that, Harding's way of climbing, even though he didn't like it, was just Harding's way of climbing, and he wasn't going to pass judgment on the way Harding climbed. So there was still sort of a dissension, a split among climbers as to whether you should or shouldn't use bolts. Most climbers favored not using bolts, to climb the mountain on its own terms and try to do it without engineering your way to the top. So enter the 1970s, the completely change of attitude towards climbing. This is a photograph of the first ascent party to do the nose in a day. Jim Bridwell in the center, he was sort of the godfather of Yosemite free climbing. John Long on the right, a very prolific climber and writer, very well known today, and Billy Westbay on the left. They climbed the nose in under 24 hours for the first time. I believe it was 1974, and they were trying to do it as quickly as possible and in as good a style as possible, and the speed record came out of it, so it was pretty good. This photograph is really famous. They were mocking a photograph that had appeared on the cover of another climbing magazine, I think it was Mountain Magazine, showing 3 European alpine guides who just completed an ascent of the Eiger, I think, and so they had been wearing their mountain sweaters and all of that, and they thought, hey, we're cool, we're groovy, we're going to do this photograph. So it's really well regarded. But during the 70s, the big walls started to become a playground for more daring, fast ascents, and especially free climbing blossomed in Yosemite. So free climbing was climbing, just hanging onto the rock, not drilling bolts, not hanging off of pitons, but just climbing the rock as you found it. Here's a photo of Lynn Hill. She was active during the 1970s, spent a lot of time climbing in the valley and all over the country, really. So, you just hang onto the rock, don't hang on gear, don't hang on the rope, and try to do the climbing, just relying on your hands and your feet and your courage. So this is a picture of another valley climber, Ron Kauk. He's hanging off of one of the pitches on the Cookie Cliff, just kind of hamming it up for the camera with a one-handed hanging rest. Really one of the best free climbers of the 1970s and 1980s for sure, but kind of typified the attitude of Yosemite free climbers back in the day. They were just hanging out, having fun, climbing hard. But then you had John Backer. He kind of took things to a different level. He started free soloing back in the 1970s, and there's a picture of him on a route called New Dimensions, a 511 route on the Cookie Cliff, which was the first 511 free soloed in Yosemite. Backer was, I think, kind of the moral authority when it came to traditional climbing. He climbed routes from the ground up. He led them, tried to climb them without falling. If he did fall, he insisted on lowering off, pulling his rope, pulling his gear, and starting over from the bottom. Climbing, to him and to many of the people who were active in that day, especially in Yosemite and Southern California, was that, climbing was an adventure, and you matched yourself against the rock, and you didn't, it wasn't a gymnastics exercise that you tried to do hard stuff and hang and monkey around up there. It was, you tried hard, and if you failed, you went down and you started over. And with free soloing in particular, that mindset, you don't get to fall off. If you fall off, you hit the ground and that you're done. You don't get to try again. So I think he kind of took that attitude toward leading and just thought, I'm going to do this in as pure a style as possible, using only, the gear I have to protect me if I fall, and if I fall, I'm done, I start over. By contrast, during the 1970s, a character named Ray Jardine showed up in Yosemite, and he really bumped the standard of free climbing up. Prior to Jardine, the hardest free climbs that had been done in the valley were, rated 512. And if you're a climber, you know how hard 512 is. If you're not a climber, it's pretty hard. Back in the day, with rock shoes that didn't really stick very well and pitons or chocks for protection, climbing hard routes where you probably were going to fall off many times before you figured it out was really hard and sometimes kind of dangerous. Jardine took a new approach. He wasn't an actual rocket scientist. I forget what his actual career title was, but he was, an engineer who liked to work out solutions to problems, breaking them down into their component parts. And he took that approach to climbing. And so he started doing what they referred to as hangdogging. So he would climb up, and if it got hard, he'd fall off, he'd hang on the rope, he'd rest, he'd work out the moves, and then he'd keep going until he got to the top. And then he'd come back another day and try to lead it all in one go. And if he fell off, he would, hang on the rope and do that all again until he'd finally worked out the moves to where he could climb the whole route from the bottom to the top without falling. So he was an early proponent of what they now call red pointing. And his first ascents were done in what, by modern terms would be good style. He worked the moves until he worked them out, and then he came back and did an ascent from bottom to top, placing all the gear on lead without falling. Jardine had an advantage over everybody else at the time. He had developed these prototype camming units that came onto the market and were known as Friends. So these were able to be slotted into a crack really quickly. You just pulled that lever back and the cams fit in the crack, and you could just stick one in just a second or two. Whereas before, if you had to place a chalk, it might take several seconds to fiddle around to get one to stick, or you might grab the wrong one and have to get another one, and you'd pump out before you got very far unless you had the rack really dialed in. But Friends made that a lot easier. And some people thought Friends were a form of cheating because they made the climbing easier. You could get your protection in seconds, and you didn't get tired as fast, so you could climb for longer and climb harder routes. And it sure worked for Jardine. Combining Friends with hangdogging allowed him to push the standards up through 512 into 513. So Jardine did the first ascent of the route pictured here, called the Phoenix, which is in Yosemite. It's a overhanging crack pitch that for a long time was rated 512 plus, but it's been confirmed as being 513A. So it was for a long time the hardest free climb in Yosemite. One other thing that Ray Jardine did, though, that was, the valley climbers didn't really accept this hangdogging of his, and they didn't like his Friends because it made the routes easier. Not that that stopped them from repeating most of Ray Jardine's routes in better style than Ray did without Friends. But Jardine also had this penchant for enhancing holds, shall we say. On the Phoenix, if you see the chalk marks on the wall in the crack below Max Jones, who's climbing there, Jardine pinned those out, hammered in some pitons, and made the pin scars, made the cracks just a little bit wider so fingertips would fit in, which created a spectacularly hard route. But he was manufacturing or making holds better, which completely went against anybody's idea of what was acceptable. But Jardine worked kind of in secret and did a lot of hard climbing that way, and some of his routes were more legitimate than others. The routes that he did chipping on were definitely not accepted, and for a long time, none of the California climbers would even go near the Phoenix or other of Jardine's routes because they just had been manufactured. They were not acceptable. They were not accepted as free climbs. They were just glorified aid climbs, examples of route engineering. So Mark Hudon on the right there and Max Jones, this was a dynamic duo that appeared on the scene in the 1970s, and they really started pushing the limits of hard free climbing. They repeated a lot of the 512 routes in Yosemite and elsewhere across the country, and they also were the first to repeat the Phoenix. Here's a picture of Mark Hudon on the second ascent of the Phoenix. Notably, if you look at his rack, he did it without friends. Placed chocks on the lead, and it's the only ascent that's been done without friends that anyone knows about. And Max Jones also followed this pitch without falling, so that was probably the only time this route was climbed by a leader and a follower without either of them falling off. So, and then Hudon and Jones, they also started pushing the limits of free climbing on the big walls. Here's a picture, two pictures of them on the Salathe wall. On the left, that's Max Jones leading the Enduro corner. If you've seen the film Free Solo, you might remember Alex Honnold soloing this pitch. It's about 2,000 feet or so off the ground, maybe a little more than that. Overhanging, falling off unroped, you'd fall a long way to the ground. But here, Max is leading it, placing chocks on the lead in 1979. And then on the right, that's another picture of Max. He's leading one of the headwall pitches, a super overhanging pitch that would eventually be free climbed as 513. But for this, it proved too hard for them to free climb the whole Salathe wall in 1979 with their limited gear and their EBs. But they really kind of pushed it to see how far they could go. Their style of climbing on the big walls was as free as can be. If they couldn't free climb a section easily or, in not too long, they would just aid through and get on to the next good free climbing. So speaking of rock shoes, so one of the big changes that occurred during the early 1980s was a change in the rubber on rock shoes. So before 1982, the cutting edge rock shoe was the EB, which is pictured here. And if you've ever climbed in EBs, you know that they didn't stick really well at all. They were kind of stiff and they didn't have a lot of friction. You had to have really good footwork to climb hard in these. Of course, climbers like John Backer, he didn't really have a problem with EBs. Here he is free soloing a 511 plus route in Joshua Tree wearing his kind of beat up old EBs. So if you had good footwork, they worked just fine. But if your footwork wasn't very good, it was really hard to climb. So in 1982 and in 1983, Firays were introduced, rock shoes made by Boreal, a Spanish company, which had much stickier rubber than EBs or any other rock shoe at the time. And they were first introduced in Yosemite in 1982. John Backer got to try a pair out and did Midnight Lightning in them. He needed a pair badly after that. They made him the North American rep, and he ordered a shipment soon after that, and all of them sold out within about 2 hours. So it was really a revolutionary shoe. Here's a photograph of John Backer on the left and Peter Croft wearing their Firays after the first link up of El Capitan and Half Dome in a single day in 1986. So these were really a remarkable breakthrough. So with the combination of the sticky rubber and friends for protection, the climbing grades kind of started to jump. People could climb harder stuff than before. And so then when of course, you added hangdogging to the mix, people started realizing, hey, I can work these routes and climb even harder stuff than anybody's ever done before. Here's a picture of Alan Watts taking a little hangdog break on a route at Smith Rock, the east face of Monkey Face, that he would eventually climb and establish as a 513D route, almost 514, but not quite. But it, for a time, was the hardest free climb in America. It's not moving. So just a sec, we're having trouble changing slides here. Okay, it's frozen up. Sorry about that, folks. There we go. Okay, so so in addition to hangdogging, here's a picture of Todd Skinner rappel inspecting a route. So climbers, not only were they hangdogging on routes to work out the moves, but they would start rappelling from the top to feel the holds and see how the sequences went. This was another cheater tactic that the traditionalist ground up crowd didn't approve of, but it did make climbing routes it was easier. It made sense if your goal was to climb harder, faster, to work the routes in this manner and using hangdogging. And then rappel bolting came on the scene. Prior to this, the only really acceptable style for placing bolts was to place them on lead. So you stand on a stance, grab your drill, hold it with one hand, grab your hammer, hold it with another, and start whacking away until you had a hole deep enough to hammer a bolt into. And that's how you place them. But when the climbers started exploring blank overhanging rock, there really was no place to let go to place a bolt. And so John Backer came up with a solution that was, it respected the ground up style. He would place a hook or tie off a knob or something to hang there for a minute while he got his bolt kit out, drilled a bolt, and then he would resume free climbing. So although he was not, doing a traditional free ascent, he was still preserving the spirit of the ground up ascent and preserving the adventure of the climb. But by the early to mid 80s, that tradition was rapidly evaporating, especially after climbers discovered power drills could allow you to place a bolt in just a few seconds practically, compared to 15 minutes or longer. So this is a picture of Alan Watts, who may be displaying the best mullet ever, drilling a bolt at Smith Rock with his Bosch drill. And speaking of Bosch drills, it got so prevalent that they were taking out advertisements in the climbing magazines advertising drills for climbers. And this just was sort of an insult to traditionalist climbers everywhere. It was bad enough that people were hanging on the rope to place bolts, but now they were doing it using power drills, and the fear was they were just going to put bolts in a grid over every cliff and there would be no more unclimbed rock forever. It was like that in a few places, but for the most part, it didn't turn out that way everywhere. So I'm going to back up now to talk about Todd Skinner. Todd was a friend of mine that I traveled with quite a bit during the early to mid 1980s. That's Todd on the right, with his friend Robin Jones on the left. Todd was quite a character, just really enthusiastic, nicest guy I think that anybody ever met. And although some people didn't like his style and approach to climbing, I don't think there was anybody who really disliked Todd as a person. They disagreed with his approach to climbing sometimes, but it was always great to see Todd, and he was always glad to see you. So Todd would write letters to me, and I'm sure all of his other climbing friends, just giving them some inspirational quotes and asking them, hey, come and join me, let's get on the road, I got these plans for next year, let's get out there and do something. So in 1985, Todd sent me this letter, which was really kind of an impetus for the book. It inspired me to get on the road with Todd in 1985, and I spent a long time on the road with Todd. I'm just going to read part of this letter from you, or for you, just to give you a flavor of the way Todd expressed himself. Hey, Pilgrim, allow me to sway you with this plan of a trip down the road of fame, glory, and the pursuit of the American dollar. I have just taken a few steps toward the goal at the end of that road, and will extend to you now an invitation to come along on the tour of the season. I think that you are going to dissolve if you have to spend another winter in Washington. And so why don't you join me on all, or at least part of the tour? No money? Absurd. No time? This is the only time of our lives when we dare spend all of our time. What I'm trying to say is I need a partner for this rash tour, and I want to know if you can leave your wife, children, dog, home, lawn, and job for this short period on a quest for glory. I'm on my way to Tucson in 2 weeks and hope to hear from you before then on your plans. Keep dreaming, stay hungry, and remember that there is no finish line. So that's just quintessential Todd Skinner. Just I'm sure that he inspired a lot of climbers, not just me, to come and join him on the road. He was always traveling on his quest to climb the hardest routes in every area of the country that he could. So traveling with Todd was sometimes a lot of fun and sometimes not. His trademark white Volkswagen van with the Wyoming plates tended to break down a lot, so we had a lot of these stops along the road. Todd was kind of a workout maniac. He even brought his own version of a climbing gym along with him. He built this apparatus that he called the Skinner box, built out of 2x4s with little pieces of wood screwed on for crimp holds and edges and pockets, and you could do all sorts of workouts in this box, and all of them were horrendous. It was really a torture device. That's Beth Wald in the box with Todd on the left looking on, HB, a very well-known Australian climber, in the middle, and me there on the right looking on. In the trees back behind the Skinner box, Todd kept a backer ladder and a pull-up bar, and if he wasn't working on a route that day, he'd be back there for hours doing pull-ups, doing his backer ladder workouts, trying to get as strong as humanly possible. So during this road trip, we ran across a lot of foreign climbers. This is a picture of Peter Croft. He's Canadian. I think that counts as foreign. Peter dropped into the valley while we were there in '85 and started free soloing a lot of routes, including the Rostrum, which really surprised a lot of people. The Rostrum is an 800-foot high cliff. The route he soloed is 511C. At that time, it was the longest, hardest, boldest free solo route ever done in Yosemite. And it was the next progression from the things that Backer had done. So Peter kind of came into Yosemite and outdid even John Backer when it came to free soloing. Jerry Moffat, the Brit, or as he was better known, the Brat, he had come into the States in '82 and '83 and '84, I think, and kind of blown things away. He, along with the French climber Patrick Edlonger and the German climber Wolfgang Gulick, had come in and easily repeated almost every hard free climb in America, including routes like the Phoenix that Jerry Moffat climbed on site. He did it on his first try without falling off one time. And the other climbers were doing similar things. So the European and foreign visiting climbers were really showing Americans that they were kind of falling behind when it came to climbing hard routes. They were doing our hardest routes in the best style possible, which kind of really got some people thinking like, wow, what are they doing? What is it that we aren't doing that they're doing? Why aren't we as good as they are? Kim Kerrigan, a visiting Australian, he came in, he repeated the Phoenix with one fall. He established a new 512C route on the Cookie Cliff. And he also made the first on-site ascent of the entire Rostrum route, including the Alien Roof. So after climbing over 700 feet of 511 climbing, he capped that off by leading a 512 roof without falling off, the first time anybody had done that. So once again, the foreigners were just really out showing us what was possible. And then Jeff Wigand, who's carrying a litter, and I don't remember why. I think he was moving it for the rescue team from one place to another so they could use it for something. That's me on the left, Todd Skinner just to my right, trying to convince me that something he's doing is really, really awesome and I should try it. Beth Wald on the right, who was traveling with us as well. What Todd was talking to me about, I think we were headed that day, was to the base of the Cookie Cliff, where Todd had decided he was going to try to free climb the first pitch of an old aid crack there called the Stigma. And on this particular day, he was joined by Jeff Wigand to his immediate right. That's Todd on the left. Jeff Wigand to his immediate right, and then Kim Kerrigan there in the yellow shorts, and a couple of German climbers who came along to also give it a try. So this whole international contingent was showing up trying to climb this route. And here's a picture of Jeff Wigand on the route. I'm going to read a little passage. Jeff proved to be kind of a foil character. He was a brash Australian. He very, very cocky. Really kind of went around talking like he was the best climber in the world, definitely better than the Americans. And so what I'm going to read from you is a chapter where we're in camp in Joshua Tree, and a lot of foreign climbers had congregated, and we were all having a long discussion about what was going on in the climbing world. The impromptu international climbers meet reconvened in our campsite that night, hosted by Todd, who within minutes was everyone's new best friend. He showed off the Skinner box and his workout setup and peppered everyone with questions about the desperate routes they had done and those they planned to do. The presence of so many foreign climbers was something new and unexpected. I had come across the occasional stray Brit, German, or Japanese climber on previous trips, but now I was engulfed by a whole cast of them, all chatting amicably about their hard climbs back home and how they compared with those in the States. The consensus seemed to be that the American climbers were pathetic by comparison, with the Brits and Australians being the most vocal about it, the Swiss and Germans more diplomatic. But overall, the impression was that their climbs back home were harder than anything in the States, and American climbers were lagging behind international standards. What was it, we wondered, that these foreign hotshots had that American climbers didn't? How did they do it? What made them so good? We decided it was their can-do, no-holds-barred attitude about free climbing. They weren't afraid to work routes on top rope before leading them free. They weren't castigated if they hung on the rope while working out the moves. They weren't vilified if they placed bolts on rappel. Also, the Europeans were batshit about training, climbing at least 300 days each year. They bouldered for technique, did laps for mileage, and holed up indoors for daily hours-long workouts, which made them strong as hell. Endless sets of pull-ups, backer ladder repetitions, and sessions on their campus boards, a new training apparatus we had only just heard about. They were fearless when it came to leading, even soloing. They didn't balk at running it out, pushing through the pain. They had the physical and mental tools to succeed, and for the most part, the Americans didn't. John Backer and a few others did, maybe, but Backer, unlike the foreign invaders, had a mental block. He was hung up on style and ethics. He had to do things the right way, which was, it seemed, the entirely wrong way if you wanted to climb the hardest routes. Jeff Wigand had a much simpler answer. It's because you're all wankers, he informed us. We're just better than you are. Get over it. So Todd Skinner had set upon this first pitch of the Stigma, thinking this super thin pin-scarred crack that he could barely get his fingers into might be the new hardest free climb in Yosemite if he could pull it off. He had an idea that it might even be harder than 513. He was definitely excited to give it a try, and he spent 13 days working on the route, top roping it, and then placing fixed pitons in the crack on rappel so that he could clip his way up it from piton to piton instead of having to place gear on the lead, because he felt that the crack was just too thin to really be able to let go long enough with one hand to fiddle in protection. So he put in the pitons, and after 13 days, he finally pulled it off, climbing the first 60 feet of the first pitch up to a stance that he could stand on and let go with his hands, which he decided was far enough. The purple and green sling you see in the picture there, that's the end of the route for him. If he can climb those last few feet, clip those slings, he will have succeeded in his mind. So he was able to pull it off. He renamed the pitch the Renegade and left a note at the base of the route saying, basically, I've done this pitch, I've renamed it the Renegade, I'm rating it 513 plus. I think that it may be 514. Please leave the pitons in place so that other people can try it. And that didn't happen. either the next day or within days, those pitons had been removed. And so the rumor was that some climbers had gone out and aid climbed the stigma repeatedly, possibly with the goal of pinning out the pin scars so that they would be bigger, so that the route would not be 514, that it was just not going to be the hardest route in Yosemite if somebody could do anything about it, because they didn't want a bunch of people coming and hang-dogging their way up this route. It was really a sore subject, so they kind of just tried to make it go away. But Alan Watts came by later that summer to give it a go. Todd had said this route might be 514, and Alan wanted to see. Alan had just free climbed the east face of Monkey Face, a 513D route, and similar style of climbing, thin crack, pin scars. So Alan thought, I'm going to try this. If it's 514, great. If it's not, I'll find out. So Alan got on it. He decided against doing the top rope inspection. He decided against putting pins in. He placed all the gear on lead, thinking that, yeah, he was going to hang dog on the route, but that's about all he was going to do. He wasn't going to do all the other things that Todd did, because he wanted his ascent to have a better claim to legitimacy than Todd's. So over the course of really 2 days, he tried it one day, took a rest day, and came back the next day, and he sent it. A total probably of about 7 tries over 2 days. He was able to free climb up to Todd's finishing point, and then because I wouldn't lower him off after he got to the stance, he decided that he would finish the last 20 feet of the crack, which was 512A, not as hard as the 513 climbing below. But after he did it, he said, nope, that's not 514, not even close. Alan thought the route was 513D. So it's hard to say if the route was harder when Todd did it and easier when Alan did it, or if Alan was just a much better climber on this steep, thin, pin-scarred crack climbing than Todd. I know the latter was true. Alan was a master of this type of climbing, but it's possible that the route was changed, altered between Todd's ascent and Alan's ascent. In any case, Alan did the second free ascent. It wasn't really well accepted either. He'd done his hang dogging. He'd pulled some gear up to finish the pitch. So anyway, it was a highly controversial route, probably made more controversial by the climbing magazines than by anything that actually happened in Yosemite. So Todd Skinner, after the stigma, he still wanted to climb something hard. He was looking for a 514 route. So I invited him up to Washington to try to free climb a route called City Park, which was just like the stigma, only longer, a long, thin, pin-scarred crack that, we knew was, if somebody free climbed it, it was going to be 513, but it was, so long and so thin that it just might be the 514 that Todd was looking for. So Todd set to work on this climb, and it also took him 13 days of effort to finally free climb the whole pitch. But this time he was hampered by something that the Yosemite locals, the index locals did. While Todd was taking a rest day, somebody had the bright idea of taking some grease from the railroad tracks near the index lower town wall and rappelling down the route and smearing several of the jams with grease. And so Todd discovered this when he came back and was preparing to get back on the route and climb it. He found out there was grease in the crack and just about lost it. He'd already spent, over a week working on this route, and he was getting close to being able to climb it. And he just thought that whoever those saboteurs were, they totally ruined his ability to climb the route. But then he went to his van, he got his butane torch out, he rappelled down the route, and he burned out the grease out of the crack with his butane torch while rappelling down. Unfortunately, he missed a spot. So in his moment of glory, after he did finally lead through the hardest part of the route and only had a very short section of relatively easy climbing to go, he reached up and stuck his hand in a pin scar and found that it was still greased. So he didn't know what to do exactly, but he was able to finish the pitch via a variation that he hadn't tried before that was a little bit easier than the regular route, but still he was able to pull through, finish the pitch, and he'd had enough of index at that point. He was angry with the locals, and he just was sick of this kind of climbing. And so he took off the next day after posing for some pictures. And the next day, Alan Watts showed up, and he almost climbed this crack on site. He almost pulled it off without falling. So it was really a testament that Alan Watts was the superior fingertip crack climber. Now, somebody else came out to try City Park right after Todd did it. This is Hugh Hare, and I don't know if any of you are familiar with Hugh, but you probably are. He's very famous in the field of biomechatronics now. Hugh kind of got his start in that field, I'd say, after his accident, where both of his legs were amputated below the knee as a result of frostbite. Hugh came back to climbing really fast, and he developed feet and legs that he could use for climbing. So he would manufacture these feet out of wooden blocks and legs out of aluminum poles that would allow him to keep climbing. And this is a picture of his face climbing feet that really worked well in the Shawangunks, which had horizontal edges everywhere, and he could toe in on those and climb all day. But on index, the rock was more vertically jointed, didn't have a lot of horizontal edges, required a lot of smearing and finesse, and these feet didn't really work very well for that. In City Park especially, it was a super thin crack where there were no good positive footholds, and Hugh wasn't sure exactly what to do. So he set to work designing a foot that he could use to free climb this route. I called it the hatchet foot. He took an acetal wedge or acetal wedges, glued them together, sanded them down to create a hatchet-shaped point that then he attached to his foot, his leg. And you can see an example of that here. He's working on free climbing City Park there. With this hatchet foot, he was able to jam his foot into the crack where mortals would have to smear on the rock or edge somewhere. So Hugh was able to repeat City Park fairly easily using his innovative design foot. A lot of climbers said, "Oh, Hugh's cheating. I mean, that's not fair. He's got these feet. He's practically front pointing up the crack." And that's true. But hey, he didn't just walk up it. Hugh was a really good, really strong climber, and also very good on cracks. And with these feet, he was able to, have footholds where, otherwise he would not have been able to do anything but pull himself up arm over arm up the crack. So Alan Watts, as I said before, he developed Smith Rock. There's a picture of him walking down into the Crooked River Gorge at Smith Rock in 1985, when there was practically no one there. He developed the area without any outside influence, really, and so he just made up his own style of climbing, which ended up involving, rappelling down cliffs, placing bolts, cleaning off loose rock, and creating some really good routes, considering the rock here was not always of the best quality. Alan was kind of, he was funny. He was sarcastic sometimes, and he didn't really smoke, but I got a picture of him with a cigarette in his mouth and threatened to show it to his mom. That's why I'm showing it here. I don't think Alan likes this picture, but I like it. Here's Alan working on one of his routes. It's a route called Rude Boys that turned out to be only 513C, but it climbs one of the most overhanging parts of one of the walls at Smith Rock, climbing a bunch of really thin edges and finger pockets for 1 or 2 fingers up the overhanging wall. This is a route that Alan tried but could not do. He did not get the first ascent. He was able once later to put it all together. But most of the time he fell off here at the crux and ended up hanging off the rope. But one of the routes that Alan was able to do, this is a picture of the east face of Monkey Face, that thin, super steep crack, an old aid crack that Alan worked out as a free climb. So this is kind of a picture of some of the crack that just shows how thin it is. Those chalk marks are from climbers free climbing on the crack. It's very thin. You can't get your fingers too deeply in places. Super hard. These hands are, this is an aid climber. Aid climbers, tend to bash their hands with their hammers and whatnot. So free climbers hopefully have prettier hands than this. But this is Alan working through the crux of the route, 130 feet of continuous 512 climbing leading to a 513 crux. When he finished this route, he rated it 513D. This was in August of 1985. It was the hardest route in America, but it kind of fell short of this goal of trying to be the first to climb a 514 in America. So the first 514 in America was not long in coming, though. There was a route that Alan had worked out and bolted on the middle face of the Dihedrals formation there, the wall to the right of the, well, in between the arete and the inside corner there, a nice sunlit wall, about 140 feet high, dead vertical to overhanging with hardly any good holds. Alan called it the Sunshine Wall because a lot of the time it was in sunshine. It was next to a route called the Sunshine Dihedral. Here's a picture of Bob Horan on the route making the 5th ascent of the route in 1987. And Bob, let's see, so Alan had tried this route, but he had been climbing too much on too many hard routes, and he ended up with arthritis in his fingers, and he just couldn't crank as hard as he wanted to. But he invited a French climber named J.B. Trabeau to come over and try it. He specifically told him, hey, I got this hard route, I'm not ready to do it yet, but you should come over and try it. There's lots of great routes at Smith Rock to do. So Trabeau came over and worked the route, and he was able to do it in the fall of 1986 to establish the first 514 in America. And so I'm going to fast forward here to 2013 when this 13-year-old kid named Drew Ruana decided to take a work burn on it. And a work burn means I'm just going to go up and work the route. I'm not really trying to climb it all in one go. I'm just going to work out sections of it, hangdog here, work out the moves so I can come back later when I'm ready and red point the pitch. So Drew started climbing up this horrendously steep, horrendously thin wall. And Drew, Drew's not the tallest climber. He doesn't have the longest reach of anybody in the world, but he's really strong. And even at 13 years old, he was blowing people away with his ability. So he just climbed up and he kept climbing and he kept not falling. And before you know it, he's right below the anchors, about to pull off this red point of a 514 route at age 13. And he did it. And so, when I saw that, there's a YouTube video you should check out of his mom took of him free climbing this route. When I saw that, I thought, wow, thanks for making a mockery of everything all of us climbers did in the 1980s. We thought we were really good and we were pushing these limits, and here these kids are coming out of nowhere and climbing all these hard routes and making us old people feel really bad. So one of the reasons that so many people, especially younger kids, are so good at climbing nowadays is because of climbing gyms. Back in the early 80s, there was no such thing as a climbing gym. If you wanted to train during the winter, you had to do pull-ups in your garage or in your basement and wait for that, that day it wasn't raining where you could maybe go out to the boulders somewhere. So unless you were traveling and climbing all over the country, you got to do pull-ups pretty much. But in 1987, Rich Johnston decided, hey, I'm going to open a climbing gym because why not? So he opened the Vertical Club late in 1987, America's first climbing gym. And at first it didn't really catch on because Rich thought climbers would love this place, and they did. But climbers are kind of cheapskates. They don't like to pay money to go climbing. And so at first it didn't really take off too much. And also, Rich didn't really have any idea what he was doing. He admits this. He, got some plywood and some epoxy and some rocks and thought, okay, how am I going to make climbing walls that people could climb on without hurting themselves. But Vertical Club opened in 1987. This is a shot of opening night. Most of the people just came to hang out and drink beer. There were a few hardcore climbers, including me up there on the right, who just thought, I'm getting a workout. I mean, this place is for climbing. I'm going to get a workout. There's a picture of Tom Hargis on the cutting edge indoor climbing wall circa 1987. It's really just plywood sheets with rocks glued to them and holes cut out and some paint that had some sort of sandy surface painted on. And by modern standards, they were terrible, but they were cutting edge back in the day and really started the indoor climbing movement in this country. Nowadays, people can go climbing anytime they want, indoors, out of the rain, air-conditioned climate, hang out with their friends, get really, really, really strong, and then go outside and climb stuff that we didn't imagine back in the day. So I finished this off with back to El Capitan. After Todd Skinner climbed the Stigma, or the Renegade as he called it, John Sherman said, hey, Todd, you know what? If you can climb that, you can free climb the Salathe Wall. And Todd hadn't really thought about that, but he thought, wow, that'd be really great. And John said, yeah, so let's go do it. But John said, I'll only do it if we don't hangdog. So Todd, being Todd, found another partner and started working on the wall. And in 1988, he and Paul Piana went up and free climbed the thing. And granted, they didn't do it in great style. Neither of them led every pitch on the route. There was hangdogging. They placed some bolts to create belay points where there weren't belay points before, breaking some longer pitches into shorter pitches so they could free climb them. But they did every move free from the bottom to the top. At least one of them did, and so the whole route had gone free, which was a really big step forward in the evolution of big wall free climbing. I mean, people thought this maybe could be done, but nobody had really given it enough of a serious effort to pull it off. But Todd, he was stubborn enough to stick with that and climb it if it took him the rest of his life. And he recruited exactly the right partner, his friend Paul Piana, who was also tenacious and hung in there. It's a picture of Paul leading the final head wall pitch, the crux of the whole route. And big wall climbing, free climbing after that, of course, evolved. Lynn Hill free climbed the nose in 1993, and then came back and did it all free in a day. So people thought that some strong guy was going to pull off the nose, but Lynn Hill beat him to it. And then you, of course, have Kevin Jorgensen and Tommy Caldwell, who free climbed the Dawn Wall, which was one of those projects that people thought, there's no way, this is Warren Harding's all-bolt extravaganza up the blankest part of El Capitan. There's no way a free climb is going to be done on that route. But again, Tommy was very persistent and hung in there year after year, kept coming back, believing that it could be done, recruited the right partner, and they worked it out and both did it, leading every pitch free all the way to the top of the wall to establish the hardest big wall climb in Yosemite at 514C. And then, you have Alex Honnold, who free soloed the free rider route on El Capitan. The free rider worked out a 512D free variation to the 513 route that, of course, nobody in their right mind would consider climbing unroped. But as we know, if we've seen the film Free Solo, Alex Honnold may not be in his right mind. He may have the right mind for this sort of thing, but the rest of us don't. But other climbers, this is Brittany Goris, who made the 5th free ascent of City Park just last year. First woman to do so, and she was followed very closely a few weeks later, I think, by another female ascent. So the ladies are kicking ass. And this is Margot Hayes. She is the first woman to climb a 515. and she apparently has just completed her second 5:15 lead. So she is really setting the trend of difficulty, you know, not only for women but for climbers all over. I mean, 5:15 wasn't even imaginable back in the 1980s when we thought 5:13 was hard and 5:14 was a dream. So it's really amazing to see these kids and all of these people really dedicating themselves to climbing in this way and pushing the standards even today. And of course, here's Drew Ruana, a bouldering champion and a competition climber who has just made the U.S. national team and has a really good shot at getting on the U.S. Olympic team for climbing in 2020. So, climbing has evolved a lot since back in the 70s and 80s. The climbers back then maybe were pushing limits and pushing the limits of what was imagined to be a correct way of climbing and the limits of what people thought was possible. And they were, taking steps. And other climbers have, they showed everyone what was possible, and people were able to take it to the next level. And over the last 30 years, they have just done things that are beyond anybody's wildest dreams. So, the controversies back in the 80s, it was kind of an awkward time, a difficult time, but looking back on it, it was kind of a humorous time in a way. Some comical things happened that looking back are kind of funny, even though they maybe didn't seem funny at the time. Alan Watts, I think, summed it up really well. There was kind of a competition to see whether sport climbing would win out over traditional climbing back then. And what Alan said was, sport climbing didn't win, traditional climbing didn't win, instead climbing won. So that's the end of my show. I just wanted to give some photo credits for some people who contributed photos to this presentation. And here are some upcoming live presentations that I have scheduled. So several around the Seattle area, but at the end of next month and into May, I'll be traveling in Utah, Wyoming, and Colorado. And I'll be kind of traveling all over. So, watch this space. If you want to see me in person, get me to sign a book for you, I'd be happy to do that.
Well, that was really fun, Jeff. Thanks. Those were great stories. I really enjoyed it. It made me want to see your other 450 slides, photographs. We did run a little bit late. We started a few minutes late, but so we just have let's go to a couple of questions, and then if there are more, we'll give them to you to answer via email.
Okay.
Scott says, "Hey Jeff, thank you for all of your writings, and I am stoked to have this latest edition to add to my collection." He asks, "What is your climbing life these days?"
Well, I'm always training for something, and I don't get out as much as I used to onto the real rocks, but I'm always hitting the climbing walls and getting in shape. And when I travel out to Wyoming and Colorado and Utah, I'm setting up dates to go climbing some classic routes while I'm out there. I've got an idea that I'm going to maybe climb some old Skinner and Piana classics at Vitavu. And I'm looking for somebody who wants to go climb the Naked Edge with me so I can do it again after 30 years.
Okay. Julian asks, this one's a little bit tough because I'm not exactly sure what route he's referring to, but he asks, was the route changed from people hammering pitons? And this is sort of maybe back there with the Ray Jardine slides.
So the two routes that I talked about that that were pinned out, maybe the Phoenix. The Phoenix was, well, it was made easier in that it maybe wasn't possible at the time before Jardine improved some of the parts of the crack so that it could be climbed. He might have changed it from a 514 to a 513. And that's, I think, kind of the danger of chipping holds on routes. If you do that to make the route possible for you, you might be robbing somebody in the future of an even harder route that they could do that you can't right now. if you're talking about the stigma or the renegade, I don't know how much or if at all the route was pinned out, but it seemed like Todd thinking the route was maybe 514, and Alan coming back and saying it was 513B. That's a pretty big difference, and so it seemed to make it seem like somebody may have gone up and just bashed in some pitons a lot to make it a little bit easier.
Okay, so we have another couple questions, and we're just going to give those to you so you can answer them via email, Jeff.
Okay.
But thanks again. That was a lot of fun, and thank you, audience, for joining us tonight. We have 3 copies of the new Hangdog Days to give away, and we will draw those names and be in touch over the next couple days to get the winners' addresses. If you didn't win a book, you can pick up a copy wherever books are sold and also on our website, mountaineersbooks.org, where if you use this code, Hangdog, Hangdog, you'll receive a 20% discount. Again, the discount code is Hangdog, but if you don't have a pencil, don't worry about it. We're going to email you the code in a day or two when we send you a recording of Jeff's presentation. So going forward, please check back on our website to find the date of our next web event, which will be in May. I'm not sure what the topic is just quite yet, but we'll have it up before too long. We hope to see you back then. And in the meantime, hey, it's almost summer, so have a great slide into that warmer weather. Thanks, everyone.